As those who were there yesterday can attest, we had a fairly lively session with some rebellion at the end, so I'll get to that. We'll note that this is a very brief overview, and of course the full report will be available elsewhere. So we were trying to come to grips with this question about the future and the future research agenda. I was afraid we were going to start with the usual position that what you might call the biodiversity lament, or for those of you familiar with the brilliant work of Francis Yates on medieval Hermeticism, might recognize the term pessimistic gnosis, very common in the environmental field. But I'm happy to report that we speedily progressed to a much more progressive view of the future and a concern about the degree to which existing trends and existing patterns of behavior would simply continue, thus causing the problems that we are all trying to avoid. I want to start with some demographics reflecting perhaps my own more social science background. We had 35 participants, 12 admitted to being natural scientists, 9 admitted to being social scientists. Presumably the other 14 were poets or some other form of humanities persuasion. We did 2 rounds of attempting to come up with some kind of research agenda. The first round, right at the beginning, ended up with more than 16, but we aggregated into 16 groups. I just wanted to point out the distribution across topics. This was the first less reflective list. 4 of them really addressed ecosystem or biodiversity science, 2 measurement and analysis, and then economics, decision-making, communications, or behavior change, and a lone purely social issue. I just wanted to point out the distribution here in terms of natural science versus social science questions. There's a very strong dominance of feeling that the real issues we have to engage with have to do with what you might call the social science arena of human behavior, communication, psychology, what it takes to change the world. So that was an interesting early finding that got reproduced in the later discussion, I think. We had 4 groups ultimately that produced some proposals about what the way forward in terms of research agenda related to biodiversity futures. I'll call these 2 groups the compliant groups because they actually came up with ideas about research agendas. Group 1, as you can see, was the group that had a little bit of focus on the scientific or natural scientific side of things. The intersection between biodiversity, ecosystem services, and adaptation was felt worthy of some further explication and analysis. The question of how biodiversity plays out across the food chain came up as a significant issue. And I want you to note the trajectory as we work through the 4 here. Then we had a suggestion that we needed revised economic models, perhaps picking up on some of the presentations we had yesterday about that. And the question of individual motivation. What is it that causes people to behave the way they do at the individual level? And a little more research on behavior. Group 2 was even more firmly in the camp of the latter part of Group 1 there. And their focus was entirely on this question about behavior change. How do we change the minds of people? What are the major agents of change? How does leadership emerge and what role can it play? In fact, I think that the point was more, how do we encourage greater leadership based on a premise that that's an important component of the mix? And then how best to influence opinion makers. If you think of the research agenda that emerges out of that Group 2 set of concerns, it's very interesting in terms of what fields and what disciplines and what areas of study one needs to engage. Obviously, all of these things have their own massive scholarship associated with them. There's whole components of the universities and the private sector research organizations and governments that focus entirely on this thing. I think what's being called for here is a form of connectivity to that. It's not that this kind of work doesn't go on. It may not have been as closely connected to the biodiversity issue as would be desirable. That we then move into the rebellious groups, although I've discovered that group 3 claims that they weren't rebellious, they just didn't want to get down on their knees and draw on the floor. And so that was the reason they didn't end up with a research agenda. Group 3 said, we don't know what the research questions are until we get our hands dirty out in the field. And by in the field, they meant less the perhaps agricultural plot and more social behavior. So their proposal really was that we need a strong program of action research where we engage actively with those components of society that have some influence on decisions, for example, and cooperatively work out in a sort of co-production kind of sense a research agenda based upon that intervention. So again, a field that's actually well developed, but perhaps not so closely connected to the biodiversity arena. And then finally, group 4, the most rebellious of all, said, we don't have we don't have time for research. There's lots of interesting research issues and policy issues, but in fact, the problems are too urgent. We need to get out there somehow and engage stakeholders. And, so that was a fairly strong sentiment, which actually underlay a lot of the discussion, I think, within the individual groups, but also in the larger discussion period about this sense of urgency. I can testify to the fact that when I started doing work in sort of environmental issues in the 1970s, that this was a common sentiment at the time. So perhaps not too much has changed. The urgency may be a little greater, but our ability to engage with it may not have, we may not have achieved the goals we would want. So those were the main areas. As a personal reflection, I tried to summarize some of the components in the form of a limerick, which I'll get to. Wow. Oh, sorry, that was supposed to be erased. The critical conclusion is, as I've said, the importance of economic, behavioral, and cultural dimensions. I think what this means is a kind of full spectrum interdisciplinarity. If we think about the research agenda itself, we really need to have the social sciences, the natural sciences, and indeed the humanities talking to each other in a very integrated way. And so I think that came through loud and clear. The other component of that was the need to go beyond the academy, to engage with society very actively. And as I said, some of the presentations yesterday take us fairly far in that direction and are a good guidepost, I think, to where we need to go. So both a strong interdisciplinarity and what some people have called trans-academic research came out strongly, I think. And finally, a personal reflection in the form of a limerick. We care about biodiversity, and we're very concerned with the perversity of continuing to grow without attempting to know what pathways won't cause great adversity. So there's the future.